Thank you for joining us today for the HOA Beat. I'm Cindy Sullivan with Key Community Management. This is Chris Gelwicks, attorney with the law office of Moretz Skufca.
Thanks for letting me come in and talk to you all.
Joining us, Chris. So we wanted to talk today about a topic that seems to come up a lot, and we thought it would be good just to have a conversation about voting requirements for homeowners association board members. Sometimes there's things that come up between meetings and you have to make a decision, and there's some laws regarding how that has to be done. So we want to talk about that so that we can help board members continue to conduct business as well as the management companies that are working with those boards.
Sure. Well, initially, to start out with the basics. Obviously, the best way for the board to take any action is to have a meeting. At that meeting, the board can take action if there are a quorum present, meaning most of the time a quorum is a majority of the directors. So if you have 5 directors, if 3 of them are there, you can conduct your meeting and make decisions. Obviously, you want to check your bylaws, you want to check your governing documents to see what your quorum requirements are. So that's the ideal situation. Sometimes boards meet monthly, sometimes boards meet less often than that. And so obviously, as you brought up, Cindy, there are times when you can't get together, and what do you do?
Right. And how important is it, Chris, to record decisions properly for a board? I mean, starting with the basics of why is it important to even do that?
Well, obviously you want to keep minutes of tracking all the decisions of what is done at a meeting, what decisions were made, and you want to be concise in those minutes. You don't want to put in any extraneous information. You want to be clear, concise. Here's the action taken. Here's what we decided. Between meetings, there are times when decisions have to be made. I recommend to our clients that if you can wait to a meeting where you get the board together and can make a decision, that's the best way. If you can't, the North Carolina Nonprofit Corporation Act allows for decisions to be made and board to take action via unanimous consent. Now, that is unanimous written consent, meaning everyone, if you have 5 members, 5 must say yes to the action for it to take place. If one member does not give you an answer, that is a no. It's not unanimous and you can't take the action. This can occur via email. You don't have to send letters back and forth. You can just do an email or a text even. Just something that can be documented and printed, and then when that consent comes in, you keep a record of that, you print it out, and you put it in with your minutes, and then at your next board meeting, you ratify the board votes on that action that was taken by unanimous consent. I always recommend that. That's a good thing. And that ratification, in the time from the unanimous consent to the board meeting, one member could have changed their mind. Well, they already said yes to it. At the ratification part at the next board meeting, they may say no to it, but you only need a majority at that point to ratify.
That's right. Well, that's good. So going back to the fact that, as community managers here at Key Community Management, our goal is to conduct business and to move forward on all the goals of the board. So let's talk about some different scenarios that can come up, because as you said, some boards are going to meet monthly, some are meeting quarterly, so things are going to potentially come up between those time periods where we need decisions. Let's talk about the different things, sort of categories, if you will, of items that could arise. What if there is an emergency situation, like maybe a tree fell and hit the clubhouse? What do we do?
See, that's something where you need to move quickly. If you have 5 board members scattered throughout the area, getting a response in a timely manner where you've got to get a tree removed from the clubhouse, you've got to get the clubhouse repaired, that is not something that would be appropriate for unanimous consent. It is that situation where you as a manager would probably be given delegated responsibility from the board to make the appropriate decision. There are times when maybe the board itself has directed an officer, for example, the president or somebody, to be the point for that decision, whatever decisions need to be made quickly. You make the decisions, you take the action, and then at your next board meeting, again, you use the ratification process and you document that in the minutes. Okay. So an example with your tree falling on the clubhouse, Whoever that would be, whether it be you or an officer of the corporation, would go ahead, make the decision on who to hire, get the tree removed, get the things in place to repair, and then at the next board meeting, you talk about it and approve what action was taken.
Right. That's good. So in other words, you're not going to be stuck with a scenario trying to reach 5, 7, 9 board
Right.
members where there's an issue.
Right, and that just wouldn't make sense. And no one, and what we're looking at here is what's reasonable under the circumstances. It would not be reasonable for you to sit there and wait on every decision having to do with an emergency issue for everybody to get back to you. So there, and it's perfectly reasonable for you to be able to take action and then go back later and talk to the board and have that ratified.
That's wonderful. Okay. So another scenario that might come up, we've talked about this recently with it being spring right now.
Mm-hmm.
So if the landscaper is asking us, hey, what color do you want your flowers this year, at the entrance area? Question on that is, because that is a contract and those items are budgeted, does that need unanimous consent, or would we maybe have a recommendation for a point person, that can make that decision?
It's that type of decision where a point person appointed by the board, again, a manager or an officer or a director that's on site, would be the appropriate way to go. So you appoint that person and give them the authority to make decisions. Do you want red pansies or blue pansies? Do you want mulch here twice a year, 3 times a year? Do you want it refreshed twice a month? How do you want that? It's those types of smaller things that would be appropriate for delegation. And if you don't delegate it, then yes, you can use the unanimous consent process. But again, that can take time.
Right.
And sometimes these vendor contracts, you say, the vendor will say, well, we're going to be out here on this date to do this. You need to give us an answer. And if you don't give them the answer, you're going to get whatever they decide. You want to be in as much control as possible. So, appointing a person to handle that by the board, whether it's a manager or an officer, would be appropriate.
I think that's important. What we find is, you don't want to get held up on progress.
Right.
Right. So what we find is if we can establish maybe a process with our board members, every community is a little different with their availability and their expertise on the board. But if we establish it up front, here's how we're going to handle these processes, then you don't have as many questions along the way.
Exactly.
That's what we find.
As much as you can think ahead for delegation and decision making, the easier it's going to flow when things arise.
Yeah, that's really good. So, what would you do as far as maybe an item, say it's between board meetings, and I have written a newsletter as a community manager, or maybe it's an annual meeting notice, and I'd like for all the board members to see it, and theoretically unanimous consent would be needed, but there's a time sensitive.
Sure.
Time factor.
You have to get the notice out in a certain time frame, and you may not get all your responses back, or you don't. It's that type of situation where, again, if you've thought ahead, if the board has thought ahead, there will be a point person, the president or someone. You can go to that person and say, I need approval to send out this newsletter. I need approval to send out this notice. I cannot get unanimous consent, and we have a time crunch.
Yeah.
Will you approve it? Hopefully, you all have a good working relationship. The president will say, yes, sure, send it out. And again, at the next board meeting, when everybody gets together, you can then talk about the decision that was made, ratify it, and move on. And I would also say, it's, when you get into something like capital improvements or something like that, when you talk about whether you should take action via unanimous consent or via meeting, big decisions like that, a capital improvement's a big decision. You're going to spend a lot of money, potentially.
Yeah, that was my next question. That's a good point. Sometimes they're not budgeted, and you say, hey, let's use some reserve money. Let's build this new pavilion at the pool, whatever it might be, $50,000. The board does have the authority. That's what's interesting. The board has a lot of authority. So that would be something they want to vote on at a meeting, but also maybe, what do we think about other input from owners?
Well, I think, and that's a good point. I think bringing in owners as much as you can to assist in making the decision is helpful. Now, keep in mind, sometimes your declaration and restrictions say that you have to get member approval if you're going to spend over a certain percentage of money. Now, that's not common. So when it's not common, it's those situations where you might want to send around a survey and say, here's what we're proposing. We have funds available to make this change. Give us your input, reply by a certain date, yes or no, give us your thoughts. I've actually seen something like that happen around the pool. Little notice goes up on a summer Saturday afternoon. Hey, we're going to be here talking about putting in the pavilion. Come ask us questions. Give us your input.
That's really good. Yeah.
While it may not be required to get member approval, I think it is certainly appropriate to try to include them as much as possible in decisions like that because you're spending their money.
Well, another thing that works also for big projects we find is if it's something where you want to get 3 bids for, a new structure. Mm-hmm. If you have a committee that is created of the members, not just board members, mm-hmm. it gives them some creative opportunity to choose vendors that they might already know about, come up with some design options, mm-hmm. and then present it to the board. So you have some input, right, mm-hmm. from them, even though they're not voting on it ultimately. That's also a good way to just, bring awareness to some other people, let them
Absolutely.
Take part in it.
Mm-hmm.
And then you could also have that full, meeting with everybody.
Absolutely.
As well.
And again, committees are wonderful because it takes the burden off the board.
Right.
It gets members involved, and that's a big deal. Members want to be involved. Many times it doesn't seem that way, but when you're talking about spending their money, they want to be involved in the decision as much as possible.
Yeah. Well, that's good. And some of them are willing to do a short-term commitment also, mm-hmm. and not, board terms can be 2-3 years. So sometimes sure. It's good to just say, hey, let's do this for a couple months. We'd like you to be involved. So one of the things we want to talk about is just, and I think you might have touched on it, but how to record. So when we make a decision between board meetings, when we have the next meeting, we're just putting in the minutes, hey, since we met last time, this was an item that came up and we voted on it and it was approved.
Right. And as I said before, the written consent, if it's in an email, you're going to want to print those out, put them in with the meeting minutes, and have the meeting minutes that are taken reflect that action was ratified. Okay. Now, one thing about the written consent, you certainly want to make sure that the question you're presenting to the board members to vote on is clear and concise. But the answer should be limited to that question. Extraneous material should not be in your consent. You should say yes or no, or I vote to approve, or I vote to disapprove. Putting in comments, understand that any comments you put in there, these are going in the meeting minutes, could potentially be seen by an owner. Right. And heaven forbid that there's litigation involved at some point about any decision, those emails are discoverable. So keep your answers directed to the question, answer the question, and don't put anything else in there.
That's good advice. Yeah, very good. So, all right, we have a question of the day. We wanted Chris to give some input on. What if you cannot get unanimous consent for an item mm-hmm. between meetings? I have an item right now where it's a new community and they have 9 board members, and there's a newsletter that I've drafted waiting for approval. And we don't yet have a process for the president just to say, Cindy, it's okay, mm-hmm. go ahead. So I'm getting ready to ask him, if he's all right with that, because I've only heard from 3 out of the 9. Mm-hmm. It's a large board, mm-hmm. and that's a big, it's a tough challenge to get approval from that many people. So, so what would you recommend? Do you wait?
Well, if you want to send out a newsletter, if you're sending out the April newsletter in May, then that's not really a good idea. You want the members to get the information. It's been approved to be sent out by the board. You drafted it. That is a situation where it just doesn't appear as though you're going to get timely unanimous consent. You go to the president, say, is this approved? If you have a good working relationship, again, they're going to say yes to it. It'll go out, and then at the next board meeting, if there's a question that arises, why was this sent out without all of us responding, you can explain, look, this is the April newsletter. We wanted to get it out before May. People are expecting this. They're paying money for it. And we can email it out. We can get it out quickly. It's not a big enough deal where there should be any problem with it. You're just going to the president and saying, hey, can I send this out?
Right. So in comparison then, we had talked a little bit about another scenario. What if it was a bill for a large project that was not budgeted, just a repair item that came up, and I was waiting for everyone to take a look at the repair and provide approval. We should probably do something different on that, you think?
Yeah, obviously you can ask for unanimous consent there, and if you get it, fine. That is not something that I would recommend you going to the president to and say, hey, give me approval to pay this.
Okay.
It's an expenditure beyond what was budgeted. That could raise some red flags. And I don't think you would want to be the one responsible for paying that and then getting flack later from the board saying, wait a minute, we didn't know what this was about. And understand, if the bill needs to be paid in 2 weeks or it's late and your next board meeting's in a month, when you send around your request for unanimous consent, you want to explain that.
Right.
Because then you can start getting delinquent notices, and then you don't want that. But anything having to do with an expenditure ideally waits for the board meeting and for approval at that meeting.
That's good. Okay, so that's what we'll relay that to the board. Well, great information. Thank you so much. So I hope our listeners have learned something today. If you have any questions that come up with your community, you can call us at Key Community Management or the law office of Moretz Skufca.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Until
it.
next time.